2004. What an amazing year for gaming. Just look at this. All of these games came out in the same year, and a good portion of them made up a lot of my childhood. Not only was it a huge year of nostalgia for me, but it was a year of some of the most impactful games ever released. The Source engine came in full swing. The 6th gen consoles were finally reaching their full potential in both the technical and graphical department. The success of the first Need for Speed Underground glorified and perpetuated the rising culture of races, fully tuned up cars with ridiculous body kits. Also, the Fast and the Furious franchise getting a sequel within the same year as the first Underground. Other racing games a year after would try to capitalize on their success, and demand for another Need for Speed game was high. And so, EA and Black Box Studios would come out with a whopper of a game, a sequel that would be bigger and have more to offer in both races, cars, and customization. Need for Speed Underground 2. Need for Speed Underground 2 was the ambitious successor that sought to do more than the original game could hope to do, coming in swinging with a big open world that you could drive around at your leisure, with a fully restructured career mode and an expanded roster of cars. On the surface, it would seem to be the first game, but on steroids. And given a bigger appetite to have more content and features, reviews were largely positive with some criticisms that are also warranted and understandable. Out of all of the Need for Speed games, this one in particular has the strongest feeling of nostalgia for me, largely due to how much time I spent simply driving around the open map, which was new for the series. So, let's dive into it, and see what we have this time around. The story and the setting of this game is set after the events of the first game, where you've dominated the streets of Olympic City and you're at your highest moment, but then you get a call being offered a spot in a crew. Of course you decline, and the result is a car crash, taking you out of the game. Sometime later you end up moving to Bayview for a change of scenery, and most likely also finding out who caused your accident in the first place. You arrive with a fully souped up 350Z, owned by Rachel, who is the same as Samantha, the chick who sponsors you and organizes races for you to participate in. You get a taste for what the endgame will feel like, driving around with her car, doing some races and even some outrun races, which is an open world approach to racing where the most distance between the two races determines the winner. Of course, the fun ends when you have no choice but to go to the car lot, and now you're back to square one. What you'll notice right off the bat is that the cars don't cost anything. In the first Underground, you could switch cars on the fly with all of your upgrades and visuals intact. This time though, it's different. Each car you buy, you'll have to invest into individually, meaning you'll be tight on money most of the time, buying what upgrades you deem necessary. So you pick your car, you go to the garage and you get started. The career mode of the game is structured into stages. In order to progress through the game, you have to obtain sponsors and fulfill their criteria, and each completion of your contracts unlock more of the game's map, as well as the later races. Each sponsor makes you do a number of races, the sponsor races that they also pick for you, a few magazines or DVD covers, and of course the URL races. The URL races, also known as the Underground Racing League, is a big part of the game. It's this game's attempt at applying track racing into an arcade setting, which honestly is pretty refreshing. The individual tracks are fine, but eventually you'll get to a point where you have to win a number of URL tournaments, each of them having their own number of races to complete and points to obtain. It becomes work at that point, and ultimately becomes one of my least favorite aspects of the game. Another huge part of the game, that is both its core and Achilles' heel, is the open world. First of all, the map of Bayview is great. Each district offers a different vibe and setting. You have the bright lights of downtown, the lower cliffside of Beacon Hill, the mountains of Jackson Heights, and the industrial sections of Cole Harbour. The races are scattered across the map. Other points of interest include the various shops that sell different upgrades, from visuals to special accessories, body kits, and performance parts. You'll also find special events whenever they're made available to you, either being a magazine or a DVD cover opportunity that you can net cash with, or a special part that you can obtain by winning a certain amount of outrun races for each stage. And of course, as I already mentioned, you have the roaming races cruising the streets. You can either leave them alone or you can challenge them to an outrun race. Depending on where you start, it'll either be quick or really annoying. Don't ever do these races on Jackson Heights, you'll be at it forever. My recommendation is to do them on the motorways that connect the city and Beacon Hill. You'll have a significantly easier time. Nowadays, open world is kind of the norm. The Need for Speed series has staved off the linear path for quite some time, and I've got to be honest here. Open world isn't always a good thing. It usually just means more work to do. Just look at Assassin's Creed Valhalla and you will see what I mean. Need for Speed Underground 2 is a pretty long game. Longer than Underground 1 I'd say, which you could beat in a day if you have enough time. But in Underground 2 it'll take a lot longer than that, because of the amount of traveling that you need to do to get from one race to another or one event to another. You complete one race in the city, and then a bunch pop up in another place, and you have to drive all the way there just to get there and then do those races, and then you've got to rinse and repeat the whole cycle again. You're going to get sick of it eventually, and in the last 2 stages, it's going to feel like work because of how many events you need to do in order to complete those contracts. If the game wasn't good, I would have given up on just the open world becoming a chore. Thankfully, it's not, because it has some of my favorite handling in the series. Right off the bat, it's pretty similar to the first Underground. The cars themselves have their own differences but are all usable. The races themselves haven't changed much either. You have your circuit, sprint, drag and drift races, except that in the drift races, you have cars now, and you also have downhill driving in Jackson Heights, and are easier because 1, there aren't any other races, and 2, they already have final scores that you just have to beat. You do have 2 additions, like Street X and URL. Street X is done on the same tracks as the drift ones, but it's more about sharp cornering and maintaining speed. They're really quick to do and are pretty easy. URL races are just circuit tracks on race courses, rather than out on the streets, and as I said, they're a big part of the career mode and you have to do them. Completing a URL race unlocks more cars that you can choose later on. Unlocking parts is a matter of progressing through the stages and discovering some of the hidden shops on the map. The car arsenal is bigger this time around too, with a lot of familiar faces and some new additions to the family. You even have SUVs put into the mix, although there's only 3. The SUV aspect is something that's entirely optional, and is just there for people that like those sort of cars. The SUV races themselves don't show up unless you're driving one, which are just circuit races basically. You can drive SUVs in other races as well, but why would you want to anyway? Moving on. My absolute favorite thing about Underground 2 and why it still holds up really well here is the customization. EA and Black Box went all out on this one. You have your standard array of body kits on top of wide body kits, and even carbon fiber versions of all the body kits. Performance parts are the same, except now you have a fully integrated dyno mode, where you can finally tune your car for different races. It gives the player a lot more freedom on how they want their car to perform. It's not a requirement, but the option is still there, and there's a surprising amount of depth to it. Car enthusiasts will appreciate this. The visual department is about the same, but with more color variety, and vinyls to play with. A huge addition as well are additional accessories, besides the ones that were already there, like the neons and the window tints. You can change the gauge of your car. You can even add neons to your trunk as well as the engine, change the color of your nitrous, and add speakers and surround sound to your trunk, and spinner rims and split doors and hydraulics. The amount of customization is incredible here, and pretty over the top. The star rating has exceeded to 10 instead of 5, and can only be obtained with the highest rated parts. And that's another thing, you need to increase the visual rating of your car to progress as well through the career mode, because those special events won't appear until you meet the visual criteria. I'm not too big on this, because it forces you to overdo the visuals of your car, limiting you in a way. I wish the special events themselves were treated as an optional thing. I preferred Underground 1's approach because it didn't force my car to actually look ugly. Of course, this game was made around the time where JDM cars would come out with massive wide body kits, and also SUVs with 24-inch rims and dollar signs on their wheels, which was known as the bling era for that time. But still, the customization is still fucking amazing here, and does a better job at it still than most of the Need for Speed games that I have played. The soundtrack is another highlight here, having a great variety of rock, electronic hip-hop and a dash of metal, from artists that were well known at the time. Depending on your music taste though, it'll either click or it'll make you mute the volume so that you can play your own music. Whether it's better than the last game is hard to say, because from Underground 1 all the way up to Pro Street, those soundtracks were all pretty amazing, so at the end of the day it just depends on your preferences. The cars themselves also sound great, with some of the muscle cars like the Ford Mustang and the Pontiac GTO sounding the way they should, and some of the newer additions either using the same car sounds from Underground 1 or new ones. You have a game that handles great and sounds great, and sound is something in a racing game that you shouldn't ignore, and is more difficult to pull off than you think. Nevertheless, Black Box knew what they were doing by this point, since they were practically wizards when it came to racing games. So all in all, Need for Speed Underground 2 still remains one of the best Need for Speed games in this series, is tied with Most Wanted being my favourite Need for Speed game of all time, and is another gem in one of the best years of gaming ever seen. It offered a big but flawed open map, with a good variety of races, great handling, a bigger selection of cars, some of the best implementations of customization I've ever seen in an arcade racer, a great soundtrack, and overall just a beautiful package. Its open world can feel like work. The story is almost non-existent with comic book style cutscenes I didn't really care much for. The villain looks like Andrew Tate. I don't really like the forced implementation of making visual ratings a criteria in order to beat the game. But the positives here far outweigh the negatives. And at the end of the day, it's a game that will always have a place in my heart. If you want an amazing arcade racer, then this is one that you have to play. Thank you for watching.